behind the infinite world that is the mind of man. Among the stars that cover the sky, in the worn profile of the old stones there are hidden truths. Another reality that we barely see. Good night. The theme of UFOs is a confusing issue, really. We say new things, sometimes new for a few acquaintances, for some less. But I am sure there are people who contemplate us with a smile of superiority. And I do not mean skeptics, I mean those who are really aware, those who know the truth. A truth that neither you nor I know because you have not put it within our reach. I would go further. I would dare to tell you that we are being the subject of a great mockery around this issue. Possible information even requisitions and sometimes steal blatantly. All this information is archived with the epigraph of high secret. And this is not inconvenient for later, without a blushing apex, say quietly in their reports that UFOs do not exist, that we must stop worrying about them. I would like to warn you that we would not enter the game. Things are really not like that. It takes with absolute seriousness, it takes with excessive rigor. Sometimes it is thought that this issue can influence organizations such as defense of each government and it is practically impossible to get there. There will be a moment, perhaps, that people like you and as I can access to what now, at this time it is considered high secret and therefore cannot be disseminated. Do not pay attention to reports such as those that we will now comment throughout this program. Do not enter the game, because those reports are really a smoke curtain. It may be better to start making a tour of the current history of UFOs to better understand this problem. There is a date that is already classic for scholars of the subject. On June 24, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a civil pilot, a businessman, flew with his plane on Mount Rainier in Washington. He voluntarily participated in the search for a missing transport plane. Suddenly, 9 objects flew in a row at about 2,000 kilometers per hour, as Arnold himself would later say. Each of them measured about 35 meters in diameter. He described them as strange dishes alluding to their form, and this term, unfortunately, has become popular. Arnold was a known person, with excellent reputation and no one doubted his word. What beautiful times those in which the word of a man was enough to make a story plausible. The newspapers took care of the case and since then they have not stopped doing it. There is another very powerful reason for the start of this story, the start of the Ovni myth, to emerge powerful, strong and capture the attention of the public. A few months later of Arnold's testimony, a dramatic event took place, the so-called Double case, which most of you will know. It was the first aggression or defense by a UFO and Tabloil was the first victim. The Madisonville place in Kentucky. The date? On January 7, 1948. The hour 14:45. Thomas Tinkle, captain in command of a Mustang F-51 squad, was informed that a UFO had been seen flying over the Gutman Military Airport and received a very simple order. Intercept it or still enough to observe its characteristics and dimensions. Mantell at the head of his squad, saw him and undertook the persecution between him and Colonel Gish, field commander. A few phrases were crossed that are already in their own right in the history of the UFO theme. I am seeing it. It seems metal. I am under the same. It is huge. And it flies at the same speed as me. Or a little more. I raise myself to 7,000 meters. My God. I see people inside. I follow him. It cannot rise more than 15,000 meters. But the object rises more and more. Good. If I can't reach him, I will abandon the persecution. Hour? 15:30. Any contact with Captain Mantell was definitively lost. The next day the remains of the disintegrated device would be 130 kilometers from the base. The official report. I would say that Mantell died when his device disintegrated chasing planet Venus. Do not forget this. We will discuss it. Do not forget that Tabloil was chasing trying to intercept this device because you received the order having seen this object flying on a military base. Let's not forget the action. Let's not forget that there is a movement that included pursued an object and that at one point even said to see people within this device. This confusion, this attempt to distort the truth, has a reason for being. Already then, when the Tabloil event took place, an official commission in the United States was already operating to study this matter. It was founded on December 30, 1947 by order of James Forrestal, which was at that time the Secretary of Defense of the United States. This commission that initiated his work to study this issue, which was the first, was called Commission Sign. In July 1948 a definitive report was raised in which the UFOs were reached that the UFOs were interplanetary vehicles. That report was thrown into the garbage basket by the then Chief of the General Staff Vandenberg, who did not believe in those nonsense. Quite the contrary. As soon as this report was completed or concluded, a new project was created, a new commission, the Grudge Commission, whose mission was to discredit any observation about UFOs. This commission closed its functions at the end of 1949. A 600-page report remained. This report was the second great mockery that the United States government directed to the public. In this report were studied, thousands of testimonies, thousands of photographs, were exhaustively analyzed. Many of them were obviously a mistake, when not malicious, many of these. From these photographs, many of these testimonies corresponded to the planet Venus, to probe balloons, to atmospheric phenomena, plasma balls. But there were 23% of cases in this report in which this mistake, this error, had to be discarded. There were 23% of cases in which there was no more explanation than such observed or photographed objects were authentic UFOs. Despite that 23%, the report concluded that the UFOs did not exist. Is it really amazing how can almost 1/4 of those reports camouflage, ignore? And despite being clear that it was not any of the objects that induce error. In spite of all that, to say that 23% did not matter and that the UFOs did not exist. The same happened with the famous Blue Book. The last commission that closed its functions on December 17, 1969. The conclusion was sharp and definitive, so definitive that it is absurd by the United States government. Likewise, according to this commission, the flying saucers, the UFOs did not exist. This is the official information, the authentic, the real one, isn't it? In folders with the head of High Secret, a series of testimonies are collected, a series of reports that we will probably never know. The CIA has actively and continuously intervened in all these projects. Provisions at FR 202 and JAN at P146 provided up to $10,000 of fine and 10 years of seclusion to any member of the Blue Book Commission. If it provided reports to people or civil media. But this governmental control on the UFO issue is not private in the United States. It can be extended to all other countries. For example, here in Spain civil pilots have orders in this regard. Well, before I don't know now if I will continue to do when there was an unidentified object that could not be confused with a plane or with a probe balloon. There was an obligation to inform in the Army to his immediate superior boss or also in the case of civil aviation. In the report that was made daily there was an institute that was the Smithsonian Institute. It seems to me that it is called that in the United States, which took note of the unidentified objects that flew in the relative speed they had, which was what had to be said in a case of these. What pilots and airport technical staff have totally prohibited is to filter, provide information to public media, for example, flight controllers, and fall into this foul. If they provide data that should not be known by the public, they are punished open. This is totally true. Things really complicate for those who study the subject. For those who study the UFO topic. On the one hand, the most truthful information, the most serious, which can provide flight controlling pilots, airport staff. Really experts are mostly kidnapped by the competent authorities and does not transcend the public. Your reports do not reach us. In addition, if we add that many of the reports of the testimonies that circulate on this subject are false, things are still more complicated. It is difficult to establish why people lie around a topic like this. Some do it for attracting attention, for appearing in the media, others for profit. There are authentic businesses mounted on this issue, especially in the United States. There are other people who do it with a sense of humor that I would not hesitate to call really pathological. But if we leave the verbal testimonies apart and we trust the graphic testimonies and take into account the photographs that are so abundant on this subject, we will find that much or at least some part of this graphic material is also false. Because a photograph is likely to be truncata, of being prepared very easily. See, for example, this photograph is one of the many that circulate there. Rather, it can be one of the many that circulate there. It looks clearly a UFO on a clear sky. In the background there are some buildings. It could happen as one more photograph. I could go on authentic. If I do not explain to you that this photograph has been taken that way. As you can appreciate, a plastic or glass sheet has been expanded in which a UFO held by two people with the sky has been drawn to the bottom, ensuring that the framing takes some buildings underneath. If you are placed at the right distance, try not to focus your camera very precisely these photographs, the more confusing, the better. You can get the photograph we have obtained. Thus many of these photographs that circulate around have been carried out. But there are other even simpler methods, if you want, since the flying saucers are that, flying saucers. Take a dish, set it in the air and photograph. They will get it. As Antonio Rivera said, not the photograph of a UFO. They would get the photograph of a dish released into the air, but you could spread it as a photograph of a UFO and many people would believe it if you have effective technical means at your fingertips as happens in a television station. You could make the trick made by the Radio Televisión French in the year 74 and that was widely broadcast. It was actually a trick and it was justified because it was for them the Day of the Holy Innocents. It is not well appreciated. There is little technical quality, since it is collected from another previous graphic testimony. The light beam is not well appreciated, the light that represents the flying saucer and that is very easy to make. It is simply an overprinting, something that is available to any television technician. As we see, graphic testimonies are not always reliable at the photograph's level, even at the level of filming. But if we abandon the graphic testimonies and take into account the purely personal testimonies, those who reach the means of dissemination in a verbal way, I would wonder how to know if these witnesses are really or not are reliable. Well, I think that fundamentally and leaving aside the study of the testimony to the experts, focusing on the person, to know perfectly his personality, his vital evolution to rule out that he is a mythomaniac, that he is a patient. Secondly, to be able to demonstrate your psychic state at the time of vision or appearance. And in the last place, to also be able to rule out that there is a profit or moral benefit, in the subject who is lending the testimony. We have to accept that in certain conditions, the planet Venus seems to be confused with a UFO. Yes, it can effectively be confused because there are a few hours of the day that are in the morning, at dawn and in the afternoon, in the evening hours in which a star or planet like Venus can be confused perfectly with an unidentified object. Also, even the moon between two layers of clouds can give an erroneous effect for a pilot or for any observer that is at a certain height. What is clear is that astronomers and photographers journalists who flew aboard the Concorde in June 1973 to photograph the sun eclipse, did not confuse with the planet Venus when they photographed the strange unidentified object that you see on your screens. If we talk about expert personnel, if we talk about reliable testimonies, because the identity of the witness, because of its profession, because of its characteristics, it is to take into account, I would consider that the most suitable witnesses would be the astronauts themselves. This has been commented many times. If there are ideal conditions for a vision, for a testimony about UFOs, this outstanding position is undoubted error in these favorable conditions. Would the UFOs really have to have testimonies of all these astronauts? Are there really? There are from the first experience in this regard, since Gagarin undertook his first orbital flight, there are more or less widespread testimonies. I do not remember that this is generally taken with great secret in which you talk about being persecuted. Even these capsules by objects not identified by authentic UFOs. If we join these favorable conditions, the fact that these pilots, these astronauts are authentic experts, we can give all reliability to the photographs we are seeing at this time. For example, this was obtained aboard the Gemini 12. Obtained on September 12, 1966, aboard the Gemini Capsule 11. This is an extension. It is a set of lights, a set of light objects not very clear. Even more confusing is this other obtained aboard the Apollo 11 capsule on June 16, 1969. These photographs. Although NASA has not spoken very favorably and has been forced by the pressure exerted by the media to spread them, they are really one of the most clear and clearest testimonies. It is, for example, obtained during the flight of Gemini 12. According to NASA experts, it could be a reflection of one of the elements that the capsule had. Product of the reflection of the sun on him. Although there will always be witnesses and there will be testimonies that will remain in the enigma, witnesses and apparently reliable testimonies for some, very doubtful for others who have been studied with real interest, such as Gill marriage. This marriage that you will remember, I am sure, many of you know it, were persecuted and later captured by the crew of a UFO, taken to the interior of the device and subjected to a series of studies, recognition, analysis. It seems clear that to have a better knowledge of us humans and then put this Gill marriage back on their car and abandon this Gill marriage, there is better. 2 hours that did not exist, 2 hours of those that did not keep memory. This issue was carried out from some time to happen by an expert psychiatrist, and through sophrosis, through deep hypnosis, they could reconstruct what had happened in those 2 hours. A lot has been written on this subject, and there is a book that has achieved a great dissemination in which it is perfectly described. However, the study that was done, well done, really well done. Even so, there are so many factors that can influence it that things are not very clear. But much more confusing are still about one of the witnesses. One of the typical protagonists of the UFO phenomenon. I am referring to Adamski, the amateur astronomer Adamski, who is almost the picaresque of the UFO Adamski theme, which has been one of the ones who have contributed the most to give to this phenomenon. To this theme of the UFOs, a character of myth. He was an amateur astronomer who had a restaurant at the foot of Mount Palomar. As you remember, one of the most important astronomical observatories in the United States had 2 telescopes, one 6 inches and another of 15, to which a camera had attached. Time passed by tracking the sky and thus managed to photograph dozens of UFOs. This one you see was one of the most impressive. Actually, if we have to be honest, we must confess that this UFO has a strange appearance, somewhat suspicious. It seems taken from a novel by Julio Verne. This is another photograph of the same object. But not only photographed his devices, but, according to him, he spoke with the crew he described more or less as it appears in this drawing. Even according to Adamski himself, he was invited on more than one occasion to take a tour of the sky to visit planets, something too fantastic to be believed. Now you will see a series of photographs of the many of the dozens of photographs he obtained in a famous, a typical Adamski flying cigar, published books, gave lectures and transmitted the message of the Venusians because, according to him, these aliens with which he established contact were Venusians. There were others, most, who did not believe anything. To us, as I said before, it seems too much science fiction. We do not believe almost nothing, but we are surely wrong. I say we are wrong because little time. About 2 years later, an event took place that threw all the theory of detractors. 2 English children, 13 and 8 years old, respectively, photographed this unemployed object in their country. Since the camera was not prepared for distance. In addition, it was a camera not very good, but still this photograph, this object, through more firewood, created much more problems because by making an orthogonal projection of this photograph and the object of Adamski photography, it was clear that it was the same type of vehicle. Of the same device. That is, what Adamski photographed 2 years before these children was the same object. There is at least Adamski did not lie. 65 similar objects were seen in Andorra and also in Finland. If it is true that Adamski triggered when talking about this issue, which seems clear is that regarding the photograph of his famous UFO, the most disclosed did not really lie the confirmation of these children. Without a doubt. Issue. Very very confusing issue, very difficult to interpret. East Adamski. To what extent was he talking about the truth? How far? Did his fantasy fly? He was probably a well-intentioned man who took advantage of a series of real events, of authentic facts, and then built a whole theory, just as it is happening in reality at this time with others, with other alleged ambassadors of the aliens. Adamski. As I say, he probably took advantage of these authentic testimonies to be able to try, rather, to influence among his contemporaries, in the sense that they abandoned their wars, that the atomic experiments abandoned. We will never really know if the aliens made messenger to him or not, but it is so science fiction. Everything that he says is difficult to believe is so beautiful. Anyway, despite being discredited, despite being insulted by newspapers, by the media, Adamski undoubtedly provided very important services to the United States government. Something more of everything that transcended the press came through his hands to the competent agencies of that time, because Adamski, when he died, was buried in the Arlington Cemetery, that cemetery that in the United States is reserved for public men, for people who have provided great services to the homeland, as in this case in these images. Do you see? It happened with the late President Kennedy. What really happened with Adamski? It remains secret, probably in the archives of a special department of the United States government. We will never know the truth. Possibly, as we may never know the truth of the UFO topic.